Thanks for joining us today, and good afternoon and welcome. I'm Nathaniel Levtow, and I serve as director of the Humanities Institute at the University of Montana. And on behalf of the faculty and College of Humanities and Sciences, I'm delighted to begin our 2018 programming season with a presentation by Christopher Preston, whose research blends the sciences and humanities in ways that perfectly communicate the interdisciplinary mission of the Humanities Institute and the critical relevance of humanities research in our country and in the world today. Before I have the honor of introducing Professor Preston, allow me to say a word of thanks on behalf of the Institute, for which he has kindly offered to speak today. The Humanities Institute is dedicated to supporting humanities scholarship at the University of Montana and to sharing humanities research with the entire UM community on campus, in the city of Missoula, and throughout the state of Montana. The Humanities Institute is therefore deeply grateful to its friends and supporters whose individual donations enable it to achieve all its goals. And I wish today to offer a special thanks to the family of Dr. Lawrence K. Pettit, Montana's first Commissioner of Higher Education, whose humanistic vision and generous support is making our entire year's programming possible, including today's event. I wish also to thank Missoula Community Access Television for helping us share humanities research projects through its Media Assistance Grants program to nonprofit organizations. And on this note, I invite our viewing audience to consider supporting the Humanities Institute at the University of Montana through its website or by communicating directly with its faculty advisors listed there, so that we may together achieve our shared vision for the University of Montana's new Humanities Institute in this, its second year. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Christopher Preston is a professor in the Department of Philosophy and a research fellow at the Mansfield Center's program on ethics and public affairs at the University of Montana. Professor Preston received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Oregon, his MA from Colorado State University in applied ethics, and his BA in philosophy from the University of Durham in the UK. After teaching at the University of South Carolina, we're fortunate that in 2007, he joined us here at UM, where he has established himself as a sought-after teacher and internationally recognized scholar in the fields of environmental philosophy, climate ethics, the ethics of emerging technologies, and feminist philosophy. He is the author of more than 36 articles in environmental philosophy, and his books include Saving Creation, Nature and Faith in the Life of Holmes Rolston III, 2009, and Grounding Knowledge, Environmental Philosophy, Epistemology, and Place, 2003. He's also the editor of 2 volumes on the ethics of climate engineering, titled Climate Justice and Geoengineering, 2016, and Engineering the Climate, the Ethics of Solar Radiation Management, published in 2012. And his newest book, The Synthetic Age, Outdesigning Evolution, Resurrecting Species, and Re-Engineering Our World, will be released by MIT Press next month. I again call attention to Professor Preston's interest and success in blending the sciences and humanities in the pursuit of research that directly addresses the greatest challenges and possibilities for our world and human society today. And in this light, he's the recipient of a Templeton Foundation grant and has won 2 National Science Foundation grants on ethics and emerging technologies. And I'd only add that I have myself received personal communications from the heads of fellowship selection committees at research institutes throughout the world, asking if I happen to know Christopher Preston, and if so, to let him know that they too would like the opportunity to support his research. And he's, of course, does so of his own initiative, including last year when he was a distinguished visiting fellow in the ethics of the Anthropocene at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. The Humanities Institute is honored to host our speaker today. And please join me in offering a warm Humanities Institute welcome to Professor of Philosophy Christopher Preston.
Thank you, Nat, for that kind introduction. Thanks, everybody, for coming out here. Thanks to the Humanities Institute for supporting my work with a research grant last summer. And I also want to thank Humanities Montana, who have also supported my work. I appreciate that. It helps me get stuff done, helps me go places. So in my lecture today, I'm actually going to do a lot of introducing things, a lot of setting the scene. After I've set the scene, I'm going to put on the table 2 red herrings, which I'm going to fillet a little bit. And then finally, in the last little third of the talk, I'm actually going to get to the main point. Now, that might sound like a bizarre way to go about things, but I think you'll see that the story will sort of fit together in a way that I hope will make sense to you. I have a technological challenge today in that what I'm seeing here is not necessarily synced with what the computer is showing up there. So if I start talking about stuff and you're seeing something up here that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about, can you kind of wave at me and say something must have gone wrong, or you must have got ahead of yourself? So I think a lot of you will have a sense of what the Anthropocene is about, but I want to give a broader introduction to the Anthropocene. We're talking here about a new designation, a new geological epoch. Currently, we're officially in the Holocene, and still officially in the Holocene, so I don't want anybody jumping the gun and claiming to be in the Anthropocene yet. We're not officially there. But the suggestion is that we've exited the Holocene, we've entered into this new epoch, which will, if the transition goes through, it will delight under the name of the Anthropocene. Now, this term came from a Dutch atmospheric chemist and an American marine biologist, Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stormer. And you'll see when they declared the Anthropocene, or at least they declared their idea of the Anthropocene, that the emphasis is on geology and ecology. So this appeared in 2000 in a fairly obscure academic journal. And they declared the Anthropocene strictly as a scientific nomenclature. You know, it was a scientific designation. They were from the sciences, and that's what the term was intended to be. Now, when you say that humans are exerting this enormous impact, this is not news. People have observed this since at least the 19th century. So this is an Italian geologist and priest, Antonio Stoppani, and in his colorful Romance language calls humans this telluric force. The planet now has this force which is every bit as powerful as the geological forces of nature. And of course, in 1873, that's quite an article of faith to declare that, because you're not going to see necessarily a lot of global sorts of impacts. But Stoppani was already on the right bandwagon. He was already seeing that humanity was going to play this enormous role. When will this finally reach a broad type of consciousness? Well, climate change is going to have a lot to do with it. And Jed Purdy, who was on campus here last year, some of you might have heard Jed talk, suggests that the Anthropocene is closely tied into climate change. And I think if you bear in mind that first designation that Crutzen and Stormer came up with was in the year 2000, think of Kyoto in the 90s, think of the sort of rise of the awareness of climate change. It's likely to be in the early part of this current millennium that this term Anthropocene really kind of takes off. If you look at the evidence that's been presented by the scientists, you see that quite a bit of it is climate related. Not all of it is climate related, but when they talk about the impact of carbon dioxide and methane, when they talk about the impacts on temperature, sea level rise, it's clear that climate change drives the conversation about the Anthropocene in fairly significant ways. But that's not the full extent of the Anthropocene. So we get factors like extinctions, different combinations of species, the way the nitrogen cycle changes. So it's climate change plus a bunch of other stuff. So Jed Purdy, himself sort of very invested in this new Anthropocene conversation, points out that the significant thing that the Anthropocene does through effects like climate change is it ends the idea of nature. You might say to yourself, okay, I've heard this story before, heard it from Bill McKibben, 1989, so we're a decade or more ahead of the contemporary discussion here. Bill McKibben said nature's ended because of climate change. And so it sounds initially like Jed Purdy is simply doing a sort of revisiting McKibben, making the same point. Maybe he thinks he's going to get more notice this time around than McKibben did. But actually, this is not all that's going on. It's not just that temperature has changed, atmospheric carbon has changed. For Purdy, this is the beginning of a whole reorienting of the sense of relationship that humans have to things outside of them. And those who are familiar with the Purdy book will remember that what he says is that there's three pillars that have collapsed. The sense that political order is natural, the sense that economic order is natural, and the sense that nature is natural. And so when Purdy declares the Anthropocene, he's saying it's part of this broader sort of spectrum of those things that we think are natural that are now getting revisited and rethought. So with Purdy, what we get is not just the end of nature in terms of the geo-biophysical thing out there, but the end of a whole sort of set of relationships, a bigger type of ending. And I'm not quite sure why that would have happened. Well, I've still got my slides here, so I'm good. All right, we're back in business. So that's that good. Gave me a chance to kind of recompose my thoughts. With Jed Purdy, we're learning that this end of nature is not the end of nature that McKibben was talking about, okay, temperatures change, nature's kind of different. It's the end of something much bigger. It's the end of something cultural. It's actually a much bigger sort of drama than if it were just a geo-biophysical phenomenon. And that's really the story of the Anthropocene, is it's become this larger thing than simply the science that Crutzen and Stormer were interested when they first declared it. So fleshing out a little bit what Purdy was thinking about with this sort of bigger idea, I've always loved this John Stuart Mill quote that nature is the cradle of our thoughts and aspirations. And so nature is, again, not just that sort of physical thing out there. It's like this sort of womb. It's this thing within which everything we think, everything we do, everything we believe, everything we dream about, within which all of that is formed. And so Mill is onto the same thing that Purdy was onto. Deepesh Chakrabarty is also pointing in the same direction when he famously says that the Anthropocene, through climate change, collapses the distinction between human history and natural history. And what he's saying is that if you're doing natural history anymore, you've got to be talking about people. And if you're talking about people, you've got to be talking about natural history. That distinction collapses in the Anthropocene. And then one more indicator of that, it's a simple line, but I heard Jenny Price say this in California a few years back, and it really sort of stuck with me, that nature and history are the two most important terms that there have ever been. It's essentially what she said. And so, what that means is that everything we do is in relation to this context, this background. And so, in order to understand human history, one has to understand nature. These two are sort of integrally linked. So, the Purdy, the Chakrabarty, the John Stuart Mill, the Jenny Price comments here, what they're illustrating is that the Anthropocene is not just something that the scientists have to worry about. It's something that humanists have to think about as well. So, what have humanists said about it? Well, Purdy's book, I had the cover flashed up a little earlier. You probably can't read the subtitle down there, but Purdy's book is subtitled A Politics for the Anthropocene. And if you start looking for books that have Anthropocene in the subtitle, you get religion in the Anthropocene, you get love in the Anthropocene, art in the Anthropocene, ontopolitics in the Anthropocene. I don't know what ontopolitics is. You get architecture in the Anthropocene. You even get economics for the Anthropocene. And so obviously, since the Anthropocene is such a big deal, it's going to be important for us to learn how to die in the Anthropocene. And before we learn how to die in the Anthropocene, it would be great if we can figure out how to make the most of the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is a big deal. Oh, I should mention, I approached a book publisher a couple of years back saying, I'm thinking about an Anthropocene book. And she kind of rolled her eyes and said, I think we've already reached peak Anthropocene. And I mean, it's pretty clear that we did. So the Anthropocene becomes something much bigger than just this geophysical thing, and it becomes an Anthropocene. And I think this is a sort of ideal way to characterize it. It's not just something you can pinpoint very precisely within the academic world. It becomes this thing, it becomes this scene, this kind of big deal. It escapes geology, it really escapes the academy completely, and becomes this massive sort of cultural phenomenon. And I think Jeremy Baskin gets it right here. It's dressed as an epoch, it's like it's dressed as if it's something scientific, but it's actually an ideology. And what sort of ideology is it? Well, I think you can capture the Anthropocene in these sorts of ways. The Anthropocene suggests us a future which is anthropogenic, which that basically means humans will be making this future. And because it's the Anthropocene, humans are going to have to play a managerial role in it. They're going to have to somehow kind of take control, and technology will be part of what is involved in taking control. And let's not forget, it could be a good, even a great Anthropocene. So that warm, rosy glow at the bottom of the slide here is supposed to sort of affirm the views of people like Earl Ellis, who calls the Anthropocene an epoch ripe with human-directed opportunity. So this is the Anthropocene, in that sense of a scene. And there's one particular part of this scene that I really want to kind of dig into today. And this is all still preamble. I haven't really finished the preamble part yet. The part of the scene that I want to dig into is the managerialism. That's sort of a mouthful, that word. But all I really mean is the idea that this is a new epoch where humans are going to have to do the driving. Humans are going to have to be in control of this sort of future. And Emma Maris, who's been on campus a few times here, has been a really powerful, influential thinker in this area. But you can get in this quote the sort of strength of that managerial ethos that is embedded in the Anthropocene. We're already running the whole Earth, whether we admit it or not. And Emma Maris is in pretty good company. There are other people who say the same sorts of things. So Mark Linus, a British environmentalist, a big Anthropocene thinker. Nature no longer runs the Earth, we do. And even Paul Crutzen, the sort of venerable architect of this whole term, and of this whole movement, if it is a movement, says about the Anthropocene and the human relationship to nature, it is we who decide what nature is and what nature will be. And by nature there, let's remember, it's not just nature with the small n, like the stuff out there, the natural world. It's nature with the big N, the sort of sum total of phenomena, the sum total of experience in the world. It's we who decide what big N nature is and what it will be. So why this managerial ethos? Well, I like this slide because you've obviously got a heron in a city park. The heron's wearing jewelry, notice, on its right foot. And when I put this slide into this presentation, it reminded me that I know plenty of sound-minded people in Missoula who think that the deer use the pedestrian crosswalks. You've heard this kind of story, that the deer in Missoula are so accustomed to being around humans that they use the pedestrian crosswalks. So in the same way that this heron wears jewelry and walks through the city and through the city park casually, we've got a world that now has to be managed, right? It's a world that can no longer sort of live freely, at least according to the Anthropocene thinkers. Now, let's just dig in just a little bit more here. Why this managerial ethos? Well, first of all, it is necessary. It's necessary because the world is already we've messed the world up in this big way. And, climate change, you might think of as being the giant oops. Nobody actually wanted to heat up the planet, right? But we did heat up the planet through development, through industry. Suddenly, oops, we've realized that we've made this enormous change to this environment we live in, and this change could be dangerous for us. So it is necessary, the managing is necessary, but the managing is also now possible. It's now possible because the world is post-wild, and post-wild is a term that a lot of Anthropocene thinkers have sort of brought along with them into this discussion. And to go back to Emma Maris again, because she's been one of the big sort of influences here. Her book Rambunctious Garden has the subtitle Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World. And in that book, you get claims like this: suddenly the vacant lot in Detroit is wilder than Yellowstone. And Peter Karyeva of the Nature Conservancy has a similar kind of quote where he says, all the parks we create are as constructed as Disneyland. Now, when Maris says this about Yellowstone, and when Karyeva says what he says about Disneyland, what they're trying to emphasize is that we have influenced these landscapes. We've built them into what they are. So that they're trying to emphasize the effect that humans have already had. But what they also inadvertently suggest is that those landscapes that were thought to be wild are now, they're just sort of part of the human realm. So if Yellowstone's like a parking lot, so there can't be anything too sort of wild or too scary in Yellowstone if it's like the parking lot. And Karyeva says our parks are like Disneyland. And Disneyland's generally a pretty safe place, I guess. I haven't been there, but I've heard, you don't go there in fear of your life. So inadvertently, whilst trying to emphasize management, what has ended up being emphasized, or what's been sort of carried into that message, is that these landscapes are no longer wild, they are post-wild. Okay, so that was all by way of introduction with that little interruption of the technology. Now I want to throw in my couple of red herrings. The main point I want to make for the rest of the presentation is I don't buy this post-wild business. There's several reasons I don't buy it. The first two are the red herrings. The third one is the one that I really want to talk about. But I don't buy this post-wild business because it's clear to me that the Anthropocene has an intransigent, so what I mean by that is a wildness that just won't go away, and also an emergent type of wildness, so a new type of wildness. There's new types of wildness emerging in the Anthropocene that I think we need to be paying attention to. So what I mean by wildness, we could now go on a huge digression and start talking about Henry David Thoreau and Muir and all those kinds of people. We're not going to go there. We're going to have a really sort of simple definition of wildness through a philosopher called Stephen Vogel, who's in Ohio at Denison. And Vogel captures wildness as simply something that is unpredictable, beyond the grasp, just something sort of surprising, something that sort of jumps out, which you weren't expecting. So we've got this very minimal definition of wildness. And my suggestion is that at least this minimal type of wildness is very much there and very much emergent in the world in which we live. So, where is this wildness? I've got three categories. The first two I'm going to speak about very, very briefly, and it's the third one that I actually want to, that's the sort of main piece I want to get to. And the first one, I'm woefully ill-qualified to speak about. And what I'm going to say about it is probably rather shallow, but I just can't resist saying something about it. So, wildness in society. We live in the post-truth epoch, right? What is that post-truth epoch create, or what does it look like? A.C. Grayling is the philosopher who was interviewed for this story that was on the BBC. He describes it as narcissistic, divisive, and corrosive of democracy. I mean, this is a familiar story, I think, to all of us in this room, that if truth is really just something you proclaim and you accept on the basis of whether it feels good, then that's not so great for democracy. And it opens the door to things like narcissism and other sort of undesirable character traits. The post-truth epoch also opens the door to a wicked sort of tribalism, which is clear to anybody in our current politics. And so if you layer post-truth with an internet that sponsors tribalism, you get a society where highly unpredictable things are going to happen. One of those highly unpredictable things that happened was Brexit. And Paul Arber's comments on Brexit are interesting because, in a way, they add a third layer to this social wildness. So layer one is the post-truth society, layer two is the tribalism. And Arber talks about the crisis of complexity, which essentially means when societies and when systems get more and more complex, for a while that works okay. That complexity helps solve problems. But then it reaches a point of diminishing returns, where the society is so complex that you can't really know exactly what is going to happen. There's no sort of management of this society that is going to be predictable or certain in any sort of fashion. And so questions like, is Britain better off in or out of Europe? It just might not be knowable. The EU itself, managing the EU, it just might not be doable. This is part of the case that Arber makes about this crisis of complexity. So post-truth, tribalism, complexity, you end up with a pretty wild society. Let's talk about wildness in artifacts, again very briefly. So drawing on Stephen Vogel again, Vogel suggests everything that we build is wild. Why is everything that we build wild? When you build something, you take an idea out of your head and you put it out there in the world. And as soon as you put it out there in the world, forces start operating on it. Things that are beyond your control start operating on it, and wild things happen, potentially wild things happen. For me, the finest illustration of this is the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. And many of you will probably have seen these film clips, but in the 40s, this bridge, basically brand new bridge, spanking new, well-engineered, sits there, and in a wind it starts to rock, and it starts to vibrate and resonate, and eventually it kind of collapses. So this fits Vogel's analysis because the wildness is inherent in the bridge. You take it out of your mind, you build it, you make it real, you realize it, literally realize it, and as soon as you realize it, that wildness is present and ineradicable. So there's wildness in our artifacts. Some of the work I've done, Nat made reference to it a little bit earlier on, is in climate engineering. Some related work I've done is in synthetic biology. Think of our climate as an artifact. So climate engineering is going to be the attempt to make the climate into something that is more desirable. So there's been this giant oops, where we've turned the climate hot, not intentionally, but maybe there will be a giant managerial when we rebuild the climate into something that is desirable. But this is going to be an artifact. And remember, when we make artifacts, when we make something real, we introduce an ineradicable element of wildness. And so there's a pretty good chance that an artifactual climate will be a fairly wild climate. Another area, synthetic biology. So we're at the point of making genomes, building genomes out of laboratory chemicals. And Craig Venter from California synthesized an artificial genome. He modeled it on an existing genome from a very small bacteria, and he thought, well, let's knock out genes until we have just the bare minimum for life. And he has commercial reasons to want to do this. But when he knocked out those genes, it turned out that you could build an organism with only 473 genes. And when I say build, I mean literally built in the lab. Of those 473 genes, Craig Venter, who is not a modest man, says, I have no idea what 145 of them do. So he said, if anything, what synthetic biology teaches you is that we need to be much more humble in relation to the biological world. So it seems to me quite likely that just as there is an ineradicable wildness in an artifactual climate, so is there an ineradicable wildness in an artifactual organism. And Purdy is onto this. So Purdy notes that in the Anthropocene, we do appear to be able to get into nature a lot more and do a lot more sorts of things. We can increase our dominance, but in the course of increasing that dominance, it appears that we have decreasing control. So that was my second red herring. Let's get to the business that the Humanities Institute hoped I was going to talk about, I think, because this is the work that I did with their support and with Humanities Montana support last summer, Wildness in Nature. And any discussion of wildness in nature, I think, has to start with animals and the sort of surprising, emergent, spontaneous kinds of actions and behaviors that animals engage in. So here we've got an urban fox, probably in London, because London is just overridden with foxes, showing that in the Anthropocene, wildlife is going to continue rearing its head, poking its nose, putting its claws in. I want to talk about a particular wildlife story, and this is a story of restoration and rewilding. You can imagine somebody who thinks the Anthropocene is going to be full of wildness is really into rewilding, so I am really into rewilding. This is a particular story about rewilding taking place in the Rocky Mountain front in Montana, up near the Blackfeet Reservation. The story of the disappearance of the bison from the Western Plains is one of the giant tragedies of North American history. So we go from something like 50 million bison down to something like 1,000, maybe less than 1,000, in a period of 4 or 5 decades, or something like that. How much is 50 million? So I worked this out. You stick a bison nose to tail in a line, you put 50 million of them in that line, and the line wraps around the earth 2.5 times. Or alternately, you take one bison and you stand another bison on its shoulders. This is like the turtles all the way down thing, right? And you put 50 million bison on top of each other, and that tower of bison stretches 34,000 miles. Okay, so 50 million is a lot of bison. These bison disappear in about 4 decades. The tragedy is entwined with the tragedy of the eradication, the genocide of indigenous peoples. It was recognized that, killing off the bison is going to be the best way to subdue the plains tribes. Here you've got a pile of bison skulls. If you look at the building that you can see on the right of the screen there, it's an industrial building, and these bison skulls are getting ground up for fertilizer, okay? So as well as some sort of wanton and reckless hunting, when the plains were riddled with all these carcasses, the bones were picked up and they were ground up and they were used for fertilizer. And the bison more or less disappears. Fortunately, people step in and realize the error. So unlike the passenger pigeon, which suffers a similar fate in a roughly similar time, with the bison there are people who say, let's do something about this. Now, one story of the restoration of the bison involves people like William Hornaday, the director of the Bronx Zoo, people like Teddy Roosevelt, and the formation of the American Bison Society in 1905. And that society plays a role in the restoration of the bison. But that's not the only story of the restoration of the bison. There's another story which is a little closer to home. And this one centers around a guy named Samuel Walking Coyote. So Samuel Walking Coyote, a Pend Oreille Indian who lived in the Flathead, got bored. And he decided, I want to live a different part of the country. So he went over the divide and he went into what's now the Blackfeet lands, lived there for a few years, took a wife, and generally enjoyed life a little better than he did back in the Flathead. But he got bored, and he decided he was going to go home. So he said to his wife, "We're going back to my home." And his wife said, "Well, okay." And Samuel said, "There's one problem. I have a wife back home already." And his wife, Sabine, who's Blackfeet, says, "Well, I don't think that's a problem. I think having more than one wife is okay." And Walking Coyote says, "No, it's not going to be okay in the Flathead because they're heavily Jesuit influenced, and one wife is the norm, so we've got a problem." So Sabine, who's obviously the brains of this relationship, says, "Let's bring gifts. If we bring with us some bison, if we say we brought you some wild bison, it might be that back in the Flathead you'll be welcomed and everything will be okay." So Samuel says, "Good idea." So this is in the 1870s. He grabs 6 bison. Now, these are some of the remaining last wild bison. Grabs 6 bison and he walks them back over the divide into the Flathead and says, "I've returned. Am I welcome?" And there's actually mixed reports about whether he was welcomed or whether he was actually given a lot of grief for this. But whatever actually happened to Samuel, his bison survived. So his bison were kept in the vicinity of St. Ignatius, where the herd started to grow. As the herd grew, so the bison were brought back in the 1870s, and as the herd started to grow, a local rancher in the 1880s and early 90s called Michel Pablo said, "Do you want to sell those bison?" And Pablo bought the bison from Samuel Walking Coyote and the group that has sort of kept an eye on them for the last decade or two, and made them part of his herd. But he also recognized the value of wild bison. So Pablo was half Blackfeet himself. He was half Mexican, half Blackfeet. He decided that keeping these wild bison pure and keeping them wild and free roaming was going to be a good thing. So he did that until the late 1890s. And in the late 1890s, the Flathead Valley was opened up for settlement. And Pablo realized the writing was on the wall. These bison were not going to be able to live wild for too much longer in that area. He realized he had to sell them, pass them on. By now he had about 700 bison. He went to the US government and said, "Do you want these bison? They're wild, they're pure, they're the real deal." The US government took a handful of them, 12, 18, something like that, which they went into Yellowstone to bolster the Yellowstone herd. And Pablo said, "Well, what about the rest of them?" And the US government said, "Not interested." So he looked north to Canada, and the Canadians said, "We're interested, those are valuable." So most of these 700 bison were sold to Canada. And Pablo had to round these animals up, right? Because they'd been living wild on the reservation for a couple of decades. And rounding up bison is not easy, I hear. I've never done it myself. But he got together this team of the best wranglers in the West. And they worked on rounding up these bison, which were then going to be put on a train at Ravalli, just sort of down from the bison range there. And they were going to be shipped by train up into Canada. It took them 5 years. It was work to get any bison to go into these train cars. And the first group of bison that successfully got into a train car, the cowboys were sort of whooping and hollering because they'd finally managed to get these things into a train car. They walked up the plank into the train car. They simply walked to the back of the train car, put their heads to the back of the car, pushed the wood aside, and walked straight out the back of the train car. So it was incredibly difficult to round up these bison. But eventually they were rounded up through all sorts of adventures and entertainment. People came to watch this because they knew it would be fun. A photographer from Butte called Norman Forsyth came, and he was friends with Charles Russell, the artist, the Western artist. And Forsyth was there getting pictures of the bison roundup, so Forsyth most likely took this one at the top, which is the sort of style of side-by-side mirror images. A buffalo is good on the turn, that says. I don't know if you can read that, but you know, the buffalo are clearly sort of indicating there that they're pretty good at evading the cowboys. So Forsyth is taking photos and gets charged by the bison. And Charles Russell paints that, sort of immortalizes Forsyth. And it's kind of an impressionistic painting. It's not real easy to see that, but you see Forsyth is up the tree there, and Forsyth is actually getting his pants ripped off. So he was up the tree, the bison go through, almost gouging his legs, but merely removing his pants. Obviously it was entertaining. Eventually the bison make it to Canada. They're headed for Buffalo National Park. Buffalo National Park is not ready yet. And so the bison get temporarily stored at Elk Island National Park. When Buffalo Park is ready, they try and round up those bison. Guess what happens? They can't round them all up. They get a bunch of them, but 70 bison get left at Elk Island National Park. And there, the Canadians just say, leave them there, you know, it's fine, there's space for them, leave those 70 there. So those 70 grow into their own big herd of free-roaming bison. And just that there's a key part of the story here. These are pure bison, right? So they've come from Samuel Walking Coyote, they've come into the Flathead where they've lived wild, they've been rounded up after several decades and gone into Canada, they've been failed to be rounded up and remain in Elk Island. These are wild bison. So everybody talks about the wild bison in Yellowstone. These bison are as wild as the ones in Yellowstone. All right, let's bring this story kind of up to the present. In 2014, the Blackfeet are amongst a number of tribes that get together with the INI initiative. And this INI initiative prioritizes bringing bison back onto native lands as an important part of cultural identity. And if you've been watching the news, you will have seen quite a lot of this in recent years, that the importance of restoring these bison up into Blackfeet lands and other lands in the plains and up into Canada. And if you've been up around Browning recently, you might yourself have seen some of these bison. So how many of you have actually seen these? You can see them from Highway 2. And so you might think that the Blackfeet are well on their way to restoring wild bison to their landscape. It's not quite true, because these bison here are not wild bison. These are the ones you see from Highway 2, are bison that have intermingled cattle genes in them. So these are actually beefalo, the sort of hybrid cow bison cross. These are not pure bison. Now they play a significant cultural role. It's not that it's a bad thing that there are these beefalo up on the reservation, but these beefalo are not the heart of bison restoration up in the Blackfeet Nation. What the Blackfeet really want to do is they want bison that can free roam off the reservation and into the Badger Medicine and into Glacier National Park. And the Business Council in 2016 proclaimed this as being a tribal goal. So this tribal goal really is not directed towards those bison you just saw, because those bison are beefalo. And they've been on the reservation for a while, and they're kept mostly behind fences. They are moved seasonally. There is a little bit of a migration. It's heavily managed. This proclamation is not really about those bison. It's about bison that they want to bring back onto the landscape to roam free between these areas. Now, to give you, many of you have probably been up there, but just to give you a sense of the size of things, the Blackfeet and the Bob Marshall complex, so the brown, orange area on the top and the dark green on the bottom, those are 1.5 million acres. The blue in the top left, that's Glacier National Park, that's about 1 million acres. The lighter green, the Badger 2 Medicine, is about 130,000 acres. You've got a really big piece of landscape here. And potentially, you could have bison moving off tribal lands up into the park. The park is open to this idea. I met with the cultural resources person on the park, and they're supporting the tribe in this endeavor. The Badger 2 Medicine is a special cultural district. It's part of the Lewis and Clark National Forest, but there's a special sort of attention paid to cultural issues and tribal issues in the Badger 2 medicine. So there really is a potential for something significant happening here. And the significant stuff is starting to happen because in April of 2016, a couple of trucks showed up on the reservation with some of those Elk Island bison. Okay, so those Elk Island bison are the pure ones. And they've done this giant circle. You know, if you think about the history I gave you, they started their life in the front there, and then they went into the Flathead, and they hung out in the Flathead, and then they went north up into Canada, and then they came back down onto the Blackfeet Reservation. And so there's 89 of them right now. They are genetically pure. They are disease-free. So you know about the bison in Yellowstone and all of the sort of ruckus about the disease that they have. These bison have no disease. The herd up in Canada had no disease. These bison were tested before they came down. They've been quarantined. They have no disease. There's no problem from an agricultural perspective with these bison. So it's a herd of 89 bison. The tribe are at the moment writing a natural resources plan for management of these bison. Also an agricultural resources plan for management of these bison, which is interesting. You know, the bison sort of have this dual kind of identity. And so the Blackfeet think they'll dot their I's and cross their T's. They'll do both those sorts of plans. And the bison will be an emblem of this giant rewilding that could perhaps unfold over the next few decades in the Rocky Mountain front. Now, this was the main part of the story I wanted to tell. Wildness in the Anthropocene. Wildness in the Anthropocene is going to be spurred on and accelerated by these kinds of restoration efforts. Now, this effort involved a lot of work, right? A lot of planning, a lot of document writing, a lot of moving of animals. But in addition to the rewilding that takes this sort of work, there's also rewilding that takes a lot less work. And I'm putting up now in front of you a bunch of other rewilding sites. So we've got Knepp Castle in Sussex, we've got the Melingerwaard in the Netherlands, we've got trees coming back in New England, so we're in the northeast United States here. This is the Velabilt in Croatia. This is the Western Iberian Peninsula. This is Scotland. We've got all these places with rewilding potential. Some of it is going to be planned and managed. A lot of it is going to be spontaneous, where land is just sort of left to do what it wants. And animals are going to appear in this landscape. Some of them are going to walk themselves in or fly themselves in. Some are going to be brought in. So you've got beavers, for example, in the UK. You've got European bison or wisent. You've got California condors. That condor, you notice, is wearing some tags. A lot of management involved in that case. You've got black-footed ferrets. You've got red squirrels. Also in the UK, you've got swift foxes on the Rocky Mountain front. You've got grizzly bears. A lot of the grizzly bear rewilding is spontaneous. You've got salmon returning where dams are taken down. You've got moose appearing in large numbers in the Rocky Mountain front. You've got jackals in Eastern Europe that haven't been in certain areas since the Iron Age showing up again. You've got marten in Europe appearing in places they hadn't appeared for a long time. You've got Eurasian lynx, which may be coming back into certain areas in the United Kingdom pretty soon. You've got this incredible potential for rewilding. It's not that sort of animals are fine, we don't have to worry about nature. Obviously we have to worry about nature, but there's this enormous potential future re-enlivening of various landscapes in the Anthropocene, right? It's interesting that this is happening in this epoch that was supposed to be the post-wild epoch. So I did my two red herrings, I did my main story. I want to draw some lessons now to close. So what are the lessons? I think one easy lesson is that the type of relationship that various cultures in various places have had with wildlife may not be static, it may now be changing. And I think in Montana, we need to think about things like, well, we haven't had grizzly bears around Missoula really for about 70 years, but we are starting to. So let's kind of rethink things there. And you might say the same about bison, you might say the same about wolves. So that's a more sort of local type of lesson about cultural relationships. A broader type of lesson, I think, is that the idea that in the Anthropocene we are now post-wild, we are now post-natural, I think that's incredibly overstated. I think it's a notion that really should never have been part of the Anthropocene discourse from the start. Environmental thinking has not been evacuated of its significance. The notions of the wild and the notions of nature have not gone away, and they belong in the Anthropocene discourse. I think I slightly overstated things in that second bullet. The Anthropocene, it is clear, so broadening this out beyond wildlife issues and nature issues, the Anthropocene, it should be clear, is not going to be post-wild. And in fact, I think we should get ready for what could be a very wild Anthropocene. So put the environmental wildlife stuff to the side for a second and think instead about the social wildness that I think is inherent in our situation. Think about the wildness potentially in the things we construct, in those artifacts. I think that is going to be a very common and pressing type of wildness. And finally, if the epoch is not post-wild, is not post-natural, we need to do a lot more thinking about what the Anthropocene actually is. And to be fair, a lot of Anthropocene thinkers are doing that. I think the sort of rush to say, it's ours, we can manage it now, there's no more wildness, there's no more nature, I think some of that has dissipated a little bit. And I think there's perhaps a more sort of maturing of this discourse about what the Anthropocene is. So I told you I didn't end up writing that Anthropocene book because peak Anthropocene had already happened. But the book's called The Synthetic Age, and it's my attempt to sort of wrestle with, all right, well, what would or could this Anthropocene look like? So I think those are 4 potential lessons of the Anthropocene and the presence of wildness in the Anthropocene. I just want to end with the Paul Kingsnorth quote, because I think Paul Kingsnorth pretty much gets it right, and perhaps has something that aligns with a lot of our experience. Thanks for your attention. Sorry about the interruptions, and sorry for going a little long.
And we do have time for discussion, questions, and so please feel free to ask any questions you might have.
I wanted to first thank you, and I just wanted to respond with an anecdote that I think illustrates what I'm talking about here. Pat and I spent 3.5 weeks in Vietnam, in the southern part of the winter session with the university class here, and the Mekong Delta is now home to almost 20 million people in the same space we have sort of 7 westernmost counties of Montana. Really densely populated, traditionally a really, really biodiverse area, but a lot of biodiversity is crashing with all the kind of things there. But there were some really wonderful signs of hope, and one we visited Katien National Park, and we hiked into a place called Crocodile Lake. Siamese crocodiles are native to Vietnam, and they've been extinct. They were completely extinguished. But they reintroduced them to this, they're from another country in Southeast Asia, and when we got there, it was really cool to see 4 or 5 crocodiles out in the lake and stuff, and signs saying, don't swim in the lake, don't go down here at night, and so forth. But the really amazing part was when at night there, it was completely dark, and then they took spotlights, and they shone them over this 10 or 15 acre lake. And what came back was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of crocodile eyes reflecting back to us. And it was such a sign of hope for me that this was a successful restoration that has brought now a bit of wildness back to a place that's incredibly densely populated, still very fragile, but it is so that even in the midst of a really, really human-dominated landscape, these kinds of things can and are happening, and that part we talk about reconsidering our relationship to there. That's going on as well, so it's really encouraging.
Yeah,
not only the rock down front, but even places densely populated as Vietnam.
Yeah, I appreciate the anecdote, and that was why I wanted to go at the end from the Rocky Mountain front over to the UK, over to the Netherlands, because actually a lot of the rewilding drive is coming from Europe. So yeah, it's exciting.
Well, I actually had a question that kind of builds upon your insights there, which is about studies that have been done on how wild animals have adapted to urban life. In places like New York City, for example, there's a great book on wild nights about, you gave the example of deers that use crosswalks here in Missoula, but there actually have been, studies done on raccoons that actually do learn how to cross streets in New York and pass on that knowledge to their young. So I was wondering, like, from that perspective, given that urbanization is often, discussed as a major sort of hallmark of the Anthropocene, how would you think about what it means to be a wild animal in an urban sort of setting like that? Because often these animals are adapting their behaviors and so forth to that human-created environment. And so I guess my question then would be, well, are they still wild, or in what sense would they still be wild, or meaningfully wild, I guess?
Yeah. So they're interesting hybrids, aren't they? That they're animals that are adapting. There's stories of swallows that are growing shorter wings when they nest under bridges so they can avoid the cars. Peregrine falcons, famous for diving at 200 miles an hour and hitting birds from above. They're living in cities and they're hunting at night where birds are illuminated by the city lights. So they're learning how to hit birds from below. Sort of really unusual, like these animals are becoming hybrids. But they are still, if you think of that really sort of general, loose definition that I had from Vogel about wildness, unpredictable, beyond human control, spontaneous, they fit that definition. So even if you are an urban coyote or an urban fox, you're still wild. And some people are sort of developing this idea of the new wild, sort of a different kind of wild for the Anthropocene. And, I would support that sort of thinking, yeah.
Seems like there's a lot of efforts to not only develop the Anthropocene as a geologic epoch, but then also to pinpoint its origin. So do you see any value in those efforts?
Yeah, it's not sort of my field, like stratigraphy. Right. There's sort of rules about how to do stratigraphy. And this is why this International Commission on Stratigraphy, they're taking a while to designate this epoch. And they have to find this global spike, or whatever they call it. I'm probably just happy enough to say, yeah, we're in a different time now, And I'm not sort of so fussed to figure out when it started. But, when you can't go anywhere on the planet without finding the trace of human doings, whether that's the climate trace or a chemical trace, it seems like we're in a different time. So, not being a stratigrapher, I don't really care when it started. I think we're in it. And what we do from here on is what's interesting and important.
I admire how you point out that a term that starts as a scientific term has evolved into a pretty wild set of discourses. In talking to my students about this term, the idea of the Anthropocene as apocalyptic, that the earth is on fire and that we are killing nature, keeps coming back over and over and over again. And that wasn't part of your presentation today. In fact, I find your last point, the non-red herring, to be hopeful. And so I'm wondering how you've encountered this as you explored the idea of the Anthropocene, and if that kind of hope is more realistic than the doom and gloom that some of the discourses of the Anthropocene are encouraging.
Yeah. So, I think you're right that the Anthropocene can be perceived as being an utter unmitigated disaster. There's nothing pure about nature anymore. It's just everything is corrupted. Or it can be perceived as sort of an opportunity. Like, okay, the world has changed. but now we kind of got to get serious about our relationship with the world. And so this is the good Anthropocene. And I indicated there were a couple of thinkers there who sort of embrace this good Anthropocene. Paul Kingsnorth, funny enough, calls those people Anthropoceniacs, right? They're just out of control Anthropocene advocates. As I said it in the response a little earlier, we're in it, and so we got to see what's possible. Like what are the sort of positive elements here? And for me, who's in some ways an old school environmentalist, I like the idea of these big parks that you kind of leave alone and you let nature do its thing. I mean, I moved from England to the US in part because I was just sort of astonished that you could have these big landscapes where things really sort of appear to be wild. So there is a positive thing that this Anthropocene is opening up for us, and rewilding is one element of that sort of positive narrative. There's other elements of the Anthropocene narrative that I find deeply depressing. So, the idea of managing climate through solar radiation management, I find that deeply depressing. That's not the kind of Anthropocene I want. But the idea of landscapes that are sort of let go, the idea of wildlife surprising us, appearing in places we couldn't imagine it would appear before. I mean, there are wolves showing up in the Netherlands and in Belgium at the moment. I mean, it's just astonishing. They originate in Russia, they come across Germany, and they end up in the Netherlands and Belgium. There's images of wolves sort of walking down suburban streets in the Netherlands. This sort of surprising, spontaneous rewilding, I think, is interesting, exciting. It demands a lot from us. But that's sort of part of the Anthropocene narrative that I think we should be paying a lot of attention to. Albert?
Picking up on your last remarks, when you start with Vogel's definition of wildness, and you scratch out wildness, and you just get the definition, and you ask someone, what does he think of? Well, it makes me think of random generators, the stock market, a poker game, but not wildness.
Yeah.
And it sort of makes us, it sort of displaces something important that you mentioned. Wildness has, wildlife especially, has a kind of presence that is powerful. And could you say something about how that fits into rewilding and what motivates us in rewilding?
So, the wildness in the stock market, or in these sort of social phenomena, the wildness in politics, that sort of thing, it's wildness in the sense of surprise and shock. I mean, as a British person, to go through the Brexit and living in America, then go through the last election, that was wild. That wasn't something that one could have predicted. But it's not, that's not the kind of wildness that gets people excited, gets people motivated. And so animals, I put animals up front and center there because, animals do get people excited. Now, interesting story. When I was in the Netherlands, I met with the head of Rewilding Europe, who's a guy called Wouter Helmer. And I had met him once before, and so I said, I'm back in town, I'd love to get together, have coffee. So I met him for coffee, and I said, Wouter, I want to learn about what are the animals that are really on the cusp of coming back in the regions that you're working in right now. And he kind of, his head sank, he kind of, his shoulders dropped. And he said, I wish people wouldn't always talk about animals when they talk about rewilding. He said, I want to talk about rivers. I want to talk about floodplains. I want to talk about erosion. He said, for me, that's as much rewilding as bringing a wolf back. And so, I thought, well, this is a Dutch guy. Of course he wants to talk about floods, But it was kind of a lesson to me that, animals are so charismatic. You put them out front in your discussion of what rewilding is. But people can also get excited about erosion and floodplains and, letting nature take its course outside of an animal or plant kingdom. And I would encourage that as much as possible.
I really want to thank you for the clarity you bring to this ethical conversation. It's really remarkable. And my question follows on this. I guess defining wildness as unpredictability doesn't seem quite sufficient, and I'm curious how you would carry that further. And I'm hearing it resonating with Kingsnorth's quotation there, which brings us back to your affirmation of earlier environmental thinking. And you mentioned Thoreau, so I must ask. I mean, his sense of wildness is the preservation, etc. Is that linked to some great force that may be the presence that Howard was talking about? I mean, what else is wildness?
Yeah, I did sort of rather sidestep the idea of a definition of wildness, didn't I? That's why I like that very minimal definition that Vogel has, because it lets you just say, well, it's the spontaneous and kind of move on, you know.
Okay.
But I have always found that Thoreau stuff very complicated, you know, to be honest. I mean, I do environmental philosophy, but I have always found that discussion very complicated. You know, like, what is wildness? What is this self-willed thing out there? What is autonomy? And I look at those questions as these sort of riddles that you never get to the bottom of. And so I leave it to, you know, really good students like Patrick Kelly to sort that stuff out, you know? And I'm actually, because a lot of my work is in philosophy of technology, I tend not to sort of dig in on those sort of definitional questions as to what the wild has to be in order for us to think it exists or think it matters.
Can I ask a follow-up question then? Because it's related to the discourse. I wonder, having lived in New York myself and in the West Coast and Southwest and Northwest, I've been very wary of New York provincialism, and I wonder if there's a kind of hubris in the post-wild discourse that you're critiquing that is perhaps urban and technocratic, and whether a closer relation in the West to nature, which is its own quandary, is more conducive to a sense of something beyond post-wild.
Mm-hmm. So I definitely think there's hubris in the idea of the post-wild, and that was sort of front and center in what I was saying, is like, we're not post-wild, we're not ever going to be post-wild. So yes, but to attach it to a sort of an urban identity versus a rural or Western, I'm not sure I would go that route. I mean, Emma Maris, for example, who is the post-wild poster child, is from Oregon. Kingsnorth is from the UK and lives in Ireland. So things don't sort of cash out the way you might think they would cash out. So yeah, I wouldn't want to speculate any further on that.
In your revisioning of the Anthropocene, you mentioned how humanities role would be somewhat of a managerial role, and that would obviously encompass politics and economics, but also technology. So I guess in what sense would you think our managerial role of technology would be to preserve nature, wildness, and post-wildness?
So, you know, I'm suspicious of thinking we can be too good at managing. I mean, obviously we have to do some managing. And I think, you know, what's striking about climate change is we got here by not managing, you know, by just not caring and not thinking about what we were doing. So there is a role for management. I'm suspicious that it should be a sort of total management that the Anthropoceniacs seem to think it should be. The role of technology it's going to be a mixed role on a case-by-case basis. I write a little bit about nanotechnology in that book, The Synthetic Age. And nanotechnology is scary to a lot of environmentalists because of the way it restructures matter at atomic and molecular levels to produce substances that really are not common on Earth, and they do sort of unusual sorts of things. But nanotechnologies are essential to efficient solar panels. And so, the environmentalist gasp at nanotechnology has to be tempered by sort of a recognition of the role that technology can play. And it's going to be a case-by-case basis. Each technology is going to have to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Those synthetic organisms that I had up there, where Venter doesn't know what 1/3 of the genes do, some of those can potentially remediate polluted sites. Some of them can potentially produce biofuels. Some of them may even be able to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, So an environmentalist who just said, I want nothing to do with synthetic biology, would perhaps be missing some opportunities, but equally an environmentalist who bought into synthetic biology hook, line, and sinker would have lost the sense of caution that I think they ought to have grown up with. So it's sort of a complicated case, a complicated story. Yeah.
Perhaps one last question, and then we do have the room for some time afterwards, so we can continue the conversation. Thank you.
One of the things I really appreciated your talk, because I have a great interest in this, both personal and professional. And I'm from Fort Peck, and there's been a lot of political difficulty returning bison to the reservation, militias, kinds of things. So 2 things I wanted to say. One is, when you use the term roam, self-consciously, I get nervous, because roam sounds a lot like purple, without purpose, or in leisure, without direction. And I think of history and the idea of progress, and the conflation of indigenous people with roaming, where indigenous people are seen as nomads, when in fact often their movements are very purposive. So there's some way in which I'm thinking about the Confederate Salish Kootenai. When they got a bunch of, there was an accompanying law case that went with the Cabell settlement, and they had a lot of cash and they bought up land with it, and they now have restored 65% of the watershed of the Jocko River. And that's what you were saying about people think of animals, but they don't quite think of landscapes like that. And they will give a marvelous tour if anyone's interested in setting that up and going. And they'll show you what they did to the river. There's a point at which then they'll just let it go. And then it will have its own wildness, but it's recovering it through a colonial history that had the incredible conflation of indigenous management with primitivism, and the political business of not allowing the Confederate Salish Kootenai tribes, when it's legal to co-manage with the government, to co-manage the bison range. That's a different layer and so on of ideological wildness, and really fraught. So I didn't want to have this end without like having just national parks as opposed to indigenous lands and homelands, and then the people themselves struggling for a different relation to those environments.
Mm-hmm. And I would say I feel pretty self-conscious, going up onto the Blackfeet Reservation and trying to understand what's going to unfold there. I don't, the relationship with the commercial herd, the beefalo herd, versus that wild herd. I'm not clear of the complexity of the relationship there. I know it's true that not every Blackfeet member is happy with the idea of these 89, even the genetically pure, disease-free ones. Not everyone's completely happy with the idea that these would go in and out kind of at will. So the story is definitely more complex than the way I present it, and I hope I can present it in a way that is not disrespectful or pays enough attention to what's actually going on.
Thank you for your questions, and please join me once again in thanking Christopher for